The following lesson is from Windows Server 2008 Active Directory Configuration 7640 Learn Smart Video Training. To find out how you can get unlimited access to our entire Learn Smart Video Training library, call 1-800-418-6789.
With Windows Server 2008, there are a couple of new things that you need to understand when it comes to installing Active Directory. Most of the basic concepts are the same, so if you've installed Active Directory in Windows Server 2003 or even Windows 2000, you're going to have the basics down. But there are some new things, some things that Microsoft has put in place to streamline the process, and also a couple of ways that we can work with it to make sure it's going to function the best in our environment. Let's take a look at how we're going to make Windows Server 2008's Active Directory get installed on our servers so that we can work with it and begin building our network. In Windows Server 2008, Active Directory is now implemented, just like almost every other feature of Windows Server 2008, as a server role. Server roles give Microsoft a way to collect all of the services, all of the features, and all of the programs needed to perform a particular function together under one umbrella. In the case of Active Directory, it's what's known as Active Directory Domain Services. When you go into Server Manager and you install the Active Directory Domain Services role, what happens is it installs the binaries to allow your computer, to allow your server to be a domain controller, but it doesn't actually create a domain controller itself. Now, this is kind of interesting because this is very different from the way that Microsoft has done it in previous versions. Once you've got the binaries installed, you still need to go ahead and run DC Promo, or through the Server Manager utility that comes up each time you log on to Windows Server 2008, there are links there to go ahead and promote the computer, now that it's got the role installed, to promote the computer to become a domain controller. By the way, a little shortcut here, if you don't want to install the role ahead of time, you can just go ahead and run DC Promo. Most network administrators, that's what they're used to doing when it comes time to create a domain controller. Start, run DC Promo. That still works in Windows Server 2008. It actually goes ahead and installs the role for you if it's not already there, and then launches into the Active Directory installation wizard. The installation wizard finally makes sense. In previous versions of Windows operating systems, Windows Server operating systems, Microsoft went through several tweaks from Windows 2000 to Windows Server 2003, changing the order in which you picked things. With Windows Server 2008, the installation wizard has been reworked again, but this time the order that they ask the questions in, it works. It makes sense when you're trying to figure out what type of domain controller that you're trying to install. Are you creating a new domain? Are you installing a replica domain controller into an existing domain? Those sorts of questions. As with previous versions of the installation wizard, it can go ahead and install and configure DNS for you, but a new feature of the installation wizard is that it can also configure DNS delegations if they're needed. Now, DNS delegations come into play when you're setting up a child domain. If you already have an Active Directory domain up and running and you're trying to create a child domain, the installation wizard can create that child DNS zone automatically, so you don't have to worry about that. That was one area where a lot of times networks would get into trouble, is with creating the proper DNS delegations to make this all work. One thing that can really throw a wrench in it, however, is the same check is done if you're setting up a brand new Active Directory environment. So if you're setting up aaronspurlock.local, it's going to try to check with the .local server to see if you have been delegated Aaron Spurlock. That, a lot of times, is not the case. So if you're setting up a brand new Active Directory environment, typically you can just ignore this question that comes up. It's going to say, hey, you know what? I couldn't delegate the DNS zone for you. Do you want to go ahead anyway? You'll just say yes and continue on along the chosen path. But remember, it can set up DNS delegations if you're setting up a child Active Directory domain. A nice thing about the installation wizard is it can also set up global catalogs for you right here as you're setting up your domain controller. It used to be that this was an added step. You would have to go in after the fact and make the system a global catalog if you wanted it to be a global catalog. No longer is that the case. Right from the beginning, you can check the box, make it a global catalog, and just go about your merry way. And of course, the basic settings, as with all of the other versions of Windows Server, when you're setting up Active Directory, what are you trying to create? This is where the big question comes, of course. If you're in a brand new environment, you're going to be creating a new forest. Are you trying to create a new domain? That comes about, of course, if you're setting up a child domain, maybe for a new business unit. Or are you trying to create a new domain controller in an existing domain? But those aren't the only questions that it's going to ask you. There are a lot of advanced choices as well if you check the box that turns on advanced mode installation. One of the choices is what NetBIOS domain name do you want to have. Microsoft is really trying to push this into the background, which is why this choice does not come up during the normal installation of Active Directory. The NetBIOS domain name is a holdover from the days of Windows NT, from the days of single label names and WINS, or the Windows Internet Naming Service. The NetBIOS domain name now is automatically chosen for you unless you turn on Advanced Mode Installation. Also, if you want to create a new domain tree, remember an Active Directory domain forest can have a disjointed namespace with several domain trees inside it. I could have an Active Directory forest that contains aaronspurlock.local as well as contoso.com within one forest. Those are separate domain trees. In order to create a brand new domain tree, however, you need to use the Advanced Mode Installation. You also can choose if you want to replicate from a particular source domain controller. If you've got one domain controller, for instance, that is dedicated to allowing you to set up new domain controllers in your environment, you would probably want to go into the Advanced Mode Installation so you could pick that domain controller for your initial replication. A lot of larger environments do this because this initial replication can really be a big hit on performance. So if you've got a domain controller that is dedicated to this replication, you want to be sure that you specify that as the source. Finally, if you're in an environment that uses the install from media when it comes to Active Directory, and this is a really great choice for organizations that are looking to roll out remote domain controllers or even read-only domain controllers, this is where you will find the install from media options underneath Advanced Mode Installation. This allows you to set up an Active Directory domain controller without requiring a full replication of the entire Active Directory database. You can actually point it to a backup or a snapshot on the hard drive and say, okay, get your initial replication from there, and then go ahead and pull in all of the other information after that initial setup is done. It can really speed things up and lower the load on your network when it comes to setting up a new Active Directory domain controller. Let's take a look at a fresh install of Windows Server 2008 so you understand where you're going to go in order to install the Active Directory Domain Services role. Inside Server Manager, which is the utility that runs every time you log on to your system, you're going to select Roles, and then you can simply choose to add a role. This brings up the Add Roles wizard, which you should get very familiar with if you're taking a look at certification, and that you're probably going to want to get very familiar with if you're looking at bringing 2008 into your environment. When I select Next, it brings up a list of all of the roles that I can install on this particular system, and the one I'm looking for at this point in time is Active Directory Domain Services. All I would do is simply check the box and click Next, and it would go ahead and install Active Directory Domain Services, as well as any prerequisites needed to make this role function properly. But that would not actually make this computer a domain controller. At that point in time, I would still have to run DC Promo, or I could click on a link inside Server Manager that, again, would basically run DC Promo for me. For those of you who are familiar with working with Windows Server operating systems in previous versions, you might prefer to simply run DC Promo directly, and you can do this as well. I'm going to cancel out of that wizard and then select Start, Run, and do it the old way, if you will, simply by typing DC Promo for Domain Controller Promotion. And this comes up and it checks to see if Active Directory Domain Services is installed, and if it's not, as in my case, it goes ahead and installs the role right then and there for you. So this is kind of the all-in-one method of making sure that you have all of the proper binaries installed, as well as launching you right into the wizard to install Active Directory for a brand new environment. Once it finishes installing the binaries, it then brings you up to the familiar Active Directory installation wizard, and this is where you could go ahead and use Advanced Mode if you wanted to, and I would recommend that you do run through Advanced Mode at least once to see all the choices, but for now, I'm just interested in getting Active Directory installed on this server. So I'll go ahead and select Next, and it gives you a little bit of information about what they call down-level clients, meaning Windows NT, and the lower security requirements that these down-level computers had. Remember, Windows NT and earlier Microsoft operating systems could not use the same types of security that we have now, and this is just giving you a warning about enabling some of those higher level functions and possibly breaking your down level clients. When I select Next, it then asks me, okay, what are you trying to do? Create a new domain in a new forest, which would set up a totally new Active Directory environment, or an existing forest. When I select existing forest, do I want to add a domain controller, or do I want to create a brand new domain? Well, I already have an Active Directory environment, so I'm going to go ahead and add a domain controller to an existing domain. So I want to go ahead and add a domain controller. I'll select Next.